The summer heat was oppressive, hanging thick in the air and clinging to Rachel's skin as she stepped out onto the terrace. The beach house was alive with the chatter of friends and family, the hum of a vacation in full swing. Yet Rachel felt oddly detached from it all, her glass of chilled white wine sweating in her hand as she stared out at the glistening ocean. She turned when she heard Lucas laugh from across the deck, his voice rising above the crowd. He was standing by the grill, tongs in one hand, a beer in the other, looking effortlessly relaxed in a linen shirt rolled up to his elbows. His wife, Rachel's best friend, Anna, stood beside him, laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back in the carefree way that Rachel envied. They looked perfect together, the kind of couple others might aspire to be. Rachel took another sip of her wine, the cool liquid doing little to ease the heat in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd noticed Lucas, his easy charm, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the quiet confidence he exuded without seeming to try. But this time, something about the way he moved, the way his gaze occasionally flicked her way, made her pulse quicken. It had been years since Rachel had felt that kind of attention. Her own marriage had ended quietly, the love eroded by time and distance until there was nothing left but paperwork and polite goodbyes. Since then, she'd thrown herself into her career, her friendships, anything to avoid the loneliness that crept in during the quiet moments. But Lucas, he made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years, and that terrified her. As the evening wore on, the group migrated indoors, seeking refuge from the heat. Rachel found herself in the kitchen, refilling her glass, when Lucas appeared behind her. "Need a top-up?" he asked, gesturing to the bottle of wine on the counter. She glanced at him, her heart stuttering at how close he was. "I think I've got it," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Lucas leaned against the counter, watching her with a faint smile. "It's been a while since we've all been together like this," he said, his tone casual. "Feels good." Rachel nodded, pouring the wine carefully. "Yeah, it's nice to get away from everything." "Anna's been looking forward to this trip for months," Lucas added, his gaze lingering on Rachel's face. "She's missed having you around." Rachel looked up at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. There was something in his expression, something unspoken but undeniable, that made her pulse race. She looked away quickly, focusing on the glass in her hand. "Well, I've missed her too," she said, her voice softer now. Lucas didn't respond immediately. The silence between them stretched, charged and heavy. Finally, he straightened, brushing past her as he reached for a beer in the fridge. His arm grazed hers, the brief contact sending a jolt through her. "Good to have you here, Rachel," he said quietly before walking back into the living room. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The air felt charged, her skin prickling with awareness. She shook her head, forcing herself to rejoin the group, but her thoughts remained on Lucas and the way his touch had lingered just a second too long. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. The house was quiet now, the others having drifted off to bed hours ago. She lay staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every glance, every word, every accidental brush of Lucas's hand against hers. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, but the warmth in her chest said otherwise. She got up, padding quietly to the kitchen for a glass of water. The cool tile floor chilled her bare feet as she filled a glass and leaned against the counter, staring out at the moonlit ocean. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw Lucas standing in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel shook her head, clutching the glass in her hand. "No, just needed some water." Lucas stepped closer, his presence filling the room. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and shorts, his hair slightly tousled, and there was something disarmingly casual about him that made Rachel's nerves hum. "Beautiful night," he said, glancing toward the window. Rachel nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, peaceful." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Lucas turned to her, his gaze steady. "Rachel," he began, his tone softer now, "have I done something to make you uncomfortable?" The question caught her off guard. "What? No, of course not," she said quickly, though her heart was racing. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "Because I feel like, I don't know, like there's something happening here. Something I can't quite ignore." Rachel's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. The air between them crackled with tension, every fiber of her being screaming for her to step back, to end this before it went any further. But she couldn't move. Lucas reached out, his fingers brushing against hers where she gripped the glass. The contact was electric, sending a shiver up her spine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I will." Rachel's mind raced, the rational part of her screaming at her to pull away. But the part of her that had felt invisible for so long, the part of her that craved connection and warmth, won out. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a vulnerability she couldn't hide. Lucas closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was soft but insistent. Rachel's body reacted before her mind could catch up, her free hand gripping the counter for support as the glass slipped from her other hand and clinked gently against the sink. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened, igniting a fire in her that she hadn't felt in years. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely wrong. But in that moment, Rachel couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "We shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice filled with regret and something else, desire. Rachel nodded, her chest heaving. "I know." But neither of them moved. Rachel's breath came in short, unsteady waves as Lucas's forehead remained pressed to hers, their silence thick with tension. She could feel the heat radiating from him, his hands still resting lightly on her waist, as if anchoring her to the moment. Her mind screamed at her to step away, to end this before it spiraled further out of control, but her body betrayed her resolve, leaning into his touch, craving more of the electricity that had just ignited between them. Lucas's hands tightened slightly on her waist, pulling her closer. "Tell me to stop," he murmured again, his voice hoarse, his breath brushing against her lips. "Please." Rachel couldn't speak. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. She knew she should tell him to stop, knew that every second she let this continue was a step deeper into forbidden territory. But the way his gaze searched hers, the way his hands fit against her body, the way her skin burned where he touched her, it was intoxicating, overwhelming, impossible to resist. "I don't know if I can," she whispered finally, her voice trembling with both fear and need. Lucas's eyes darkened, the faint hesitation in his expression melting away. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his lips capturing hers with an urgency that left no room for doubt. Rachel's hands moved of their own accord, sliding up his chest, feeling the solid strength beneath her fingers. His touch was everywhere, her waist, her back, her arms, as if he couldn't get enough of her. When his lips trailed from her mouth to her jawline and down the curve of her neck, Rachel gasped softly, her head tilting back to give him better access. His hands slid lower, gripping her hips as he pressed her against the counter. The cold edge of the granite was a sharp contrast to the heat consuming her, grounding her even as she felt herself spiraling further. "Lucas," she murmured, her voice catching as his lips found the sensitive spot just beneath her ear. We shouldn't." "I know," he whispered against her skin, his voice heavy with both regret and longing. "But I can't stop." Rachel's heart pounded, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She wanted to stop, needed to stop, but the pull of him, the way he made her feel alive and desired in a way she hadn't in years, was too powerful. Her hands tangled in his hair as he kissed her again, her body arching into his as if it had a mind of its own. Before she knew it, Lucas's hands were sliding under the hem of her shirt, his fingers grazing the bare skin of her lower back. The touch sent a shiver up her spine, and she instinctively pressed closer to him, craving more. His lips returned to hers, more demanding now, as his hands roamed her back, her sides, learning every curve. Rachel's own hands grew bolder, tracing the lines of his shoulders and down his arms, memorizing the feel of him. She knew every moment they let this continue was a moment too far, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. The rest of the world faded, her best friend, the house full of people, the consequences waiting on the other side of the moment. All that mattered was Lucas, his touch, his kiss, the way he made her feel. He lifted her slightly, sitting her on the counter with ease, and she gasped as the movement brought them even closer. His hands framed her face as he kissed her again, and Rachel wrapped her legs around him instinctively, holding him to her. The intensity of their connection was dizzying, and for a brief, reckless moment, she allowed herself to forget everything else. But reality was never far away. The sound of a creak in the hallway broke through the haze, and Rachel froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Lucas stilled as well, his breathing ragged as he glanced toward the door. They remained like that for a long moment, their bodies still pressed together, the weight of what they'd just done hanging heavily between them. "We can't do this," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. We can't. Lucas closed his eyes, his hands dropping to her sides. I know, he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of regret and longing. I know. Slowly, reluctantly, Rachel unwrapped her legs from around him and slid off the counter, her hands trembling as she adjusted her shirt. Lucas stepped back, running a hand through his hair as he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I should go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, his jaw tightening. Rachel. Lucas didn't step back this time. His hand, instead of retreating, moved to her face, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek as he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His jaw was tight, his gaze searching hers for something, permission, clarity, or perhaps just the courage to speak what neither of them dared to say aloud. Rachel, he murmured, his voice rough, I don't want this to end here. Her heart thundered in her chest, the words igniting both fear and desire within her. She opened her mouth to respond, but Lucas closed the space between them, his hands sliding down her arms, gripping her waist and pulling her close once more. His forehead pressed lightly against hers as he whispered, Tell me you feel it too. Rachel's lips trembled as she searched his eyes, her resolve crumbling under the weight of his touch. I do, she admitted, her voice shaking. I feel it. Lucas's breath hitched, his hands tightening on her hips as if anchoring her to the moment. Then let me show you, he whispered, his voice raw and pleading. Let me give you something real, something just for us. Before she could answer, his lips were on hers again, urgent and demanding. This time Rachel didn't resist. She surrendered to the pull, her hands sliding up to his chest and clutching at his shirt as the kiss deepened. The world around them dissolved, the only sound the soft gasps and whispers that passed between them. Lucas's hands roamed her body, tentative at first, but growing bolder as he felt her respond to his touch. His fingers slipped beneath the hem of her shirt, tracing the curve of her waist, and Rachel shivered at the warmth of his palms against her skin. Her body reacted instinctively, arching into him, craving more of the connection she had denied herself for so long. He lifted her again, setting her back on the counter with ease, and the position brought them impossibly closer. Rachel gasped against his lips as he trailed kisses down her jawline to her neck, his hands exploring her as though he were memorizing every inch of her. Her own hands were no longer hesitant, sliding under his shirt to feel the hard planes of his back, the tension in his muscles matching the intensity of their shared desire. Rachel, Lucas murmured against her skin, his voice a mixture of desperation and reverence. You're incredible. I've thought about this, about you, more than I should admit. His confession sent a rush of heat through her, and she pulled him closer, her lips finding his again in a kiss that felt both urgent and consuming. She didn't care about the consequences in that moment, didn't care about the line they were crossing or the people they were betraying. All she cared about was the way Lucas made her feel, alive, desired, seen. His hands slid further up her sides, the touch igniting sparks that made her breath hitch. We shouldn't, she whispered faintly, her words conflicting with the way her body pressed into his, begging for more. I know, Lucas replied, his voice strained, his lips grazing the sensitive skin just below her ear. But I don't want to stop. Rachel's head fell back, her resolve completely shattered. His hands found the clasp of her bra, hesitating only briefly before undoing it with a practiced ease that made her pulse quicken. The cool air against her skin was immediately replaced by the warmth of his touch, and she let out a soft moan as his lips followed, leaving a trail of fire wherever they went. Their movements became a blur of passion and need, each touch, each kiss more intimate than the last. The boundaries that had once seemed so solid now felt like distant memories, replaced by the undeniable pull of the moment. As Lucas's hands moved lower, his lips never leaving hers, Rachel felt a surge of both freedom and fear. She clung to him, her nails digging into his back, her mind spinning with the weight of what they were doing. It was reckless, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating. Lucas, she gasped, pulling back just enough to meet his gaze. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I've never felt this way before. His expression softened, his hands cupping her face as he looked at her with a mix of desire and something deeper. Neither have I, he said, his voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. You make me feel like I found something I didn't even know I was missing. Rachel's heart clenched at his words, and for a fleeting moment, she let herself believe in the possibility of something more, something beyond the stolen moments and forbidden touches. But even as she lost herself in his embrace, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that this could only end in heartbreak. Still, she couldn't bring herself to stop. Not yet. Not when she finally felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. And so, she let Lucas pull her closer, let his hands and lips and whispered words drown out the doubts and fears, if only for a little while longer. The hesitation between them evaporated like morning mist as Lucas's lips claimed hers again, this time with an intensity that left no room for restraint. Rachel's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as their breaths intermingled, each kiss deeper and more urgent than the last. Her body pressed against his instinctively, the edge of the counter digging into her back, but grounding her in the reality of what was unfolding. His hands roamed her body, no longer tentative but reverent, as if memorizing every curve, every sensation. Rachel gasped as his lips trailed from her mouth to her neck, his stubble grazing her skin and leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Her head tilted back, surrendering completely as he kissed along her collarbone, his hands slipping under her shirt and sliding up her sides. The touch sent a shiver through her, every nerve in her body alive with sensation. Lucas paused, his fingers resting just below the curve of her ribcage as he looked up at her, his eyes dark with desire, but also with an unspoken question. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his voice low and rough. Rachel swallowed hard, her pulse racing. Every logical thought screamed at her to stop, to pull away, to walk out of the room before they crossed a line they could never uncross. But the need burning inside her, the connection that had been simmering between them for days, silenced those thoughts. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." His hesitation disappeared, replaced by a renewed urgency as he lifted her shirt over her head, his fingers grazing her bare skin and leaving goosebumps in their wake. Rachel shivered under his touch, her own hands moving to unbutton his shirt and push it off his shoulders. The fabric fell to the floor, and she marveled at the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the strength in his shoulders and arms as he pulled her closer. Their movements became a blur of passion, their breaths mingling as clothes were shed piece by piece, each barrier between them falling away. Lucas's hands were everywhere, on her back, her hips, her thighs, his touch both gentle and insistent, leaving her breathless and wanting more. Rachel's own hands explored his body, her fingers trailing over the planes of his chest and the curve of his spine, committing every detail to memory. When Lucas lifted her into his arms, carrying her away from the counter and toward the couch, Rachel let out a soft laugh, the sound muffled by his kisses. He laid her down gently, his body following hers, and she felt the weight of him against her, solid and grounding and intoxicating all at once. His lips found hers again, slower this time, as if savoring every moment. "Rachel," he murmured against her mouth, his voice filled with both desire and something deeper. "You're incredible." She couldn't find the words to respond, so she let her actions speak for her, pulling him closer and kissing him with a passion that surprised even herself. The world outside disappeared, their surroundings fading into the background as they lost themselves in each other. The only sounds were their whispered names, their shared gasps, the rustle of fabric and the soft creak of the couch beneath them. Every touch, every kiss, every movement was electric, a perfect blend of urgency and tenderness. Rachel felt herself unraveling, every barrier she had built over the years crumbling under the weight of Lucas's touch. She hadn't realized how much she'd been longing for this, for the connection, the intimacy, the raw, unfiltered passion. As they came together, their breaths quickening and their bodies moving in perfect rhythm, Rachel felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely out of character for her. But it was also exhilarating, like stepping into a world where nothing else mattered but the way Lucas made her feel. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the couch, their bodies still pressed close as they caught their breath. Lucas's hand rested on her hip, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her skin, while Rachel's head rested on his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat grounding her in the moment. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable, filled with the weight of what had just happened and the unspoken questions that lingered between them. Finally, Lucas broke the silence. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with concern. Rachel nodded, her fingers idly tracing patterns on his chest. "I'm okay," she said, her voice quiet but steady. I don't know what this means." Lucas sighed, his hand sliding up to cup her cheek, guiding her face toward his. "It means whatever you want it to mean," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I don't regret this, Rachel. Not for a second. But I don't want to make things harder for you." His words sent a pang through her chest, and she bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. She didn't regret it either, How could she, when it had been the most alive she'd felt in years? But the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. Anna's face flashed in her mind, and a wave of guilt crashed over her, threatening to drown the fleeting joy she'd just felt. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan for this. For any of this." Lucas pulled her closer, his lips brushing against her forehead in a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Neither did I," he said softly. "But here we are." Rachel closed her eyes, willing herself to hold on to the moment a little longer before reality crept back in. She knew there would be consequences, that the fragile balance of their lives could never be the same. But for now, all she could do was breathe, her body still pressed against his, and hope that somehow they could find a way to navigate the impossible road ahead. The room seemed to pulse with a charged silence as Lucas held her gaze, his hands still tracing slow, deliberate circles on her hips. The air between them felt thicker now, heavy with a mix of unspoken words and desires too strong to ignore. Rachel's breath quickened as Lucas leaned in, his lips brushing hers once again, softer this time, his touch slow and reverent. The world outside the moment faded completely, the distant sound of waves crashing on the beach muted into nothingness. Lucas's fingers slid gently along her skin, igniting a trail of warmth wherever they lingered, and Rachel felt herself surrendering further. Every sense was heightened. The faint scent of his cologne mingled with the salty air from the open window, the feel of his breath against her neck, the way her body responded to his every movement like it had been waiting for this moment all along. Their movements grew more fluid, their rhythm natural and unhurried, as though they were discovering a language they already knew by heart. The soft rustle of fabric falling away and the quiet whispers of reassurance shared in the dark became the only sounds between them. The room's dim light cast shadows that danced across their entwined forms, heightening the intimacy of their stolen moment. Lucas's touch was both grounding and electrifying, guiding her deeper into an uncharted territory she couldn't have imagined but didn't want to leave. Rachel's fingers found their way to him, exploring the contours of his shoulders and back, anchoring herself to the reality of what was happening while letting herself be carried away by the storm of sensation. Time seemed to lose all meaning as they became wholly immersed in each other, their breaths merging in the stillness, their movements fluid and instinctive. It was an experience that felt both new and achingly familiar, like rediscovering something she had lost long ago. Rachel felt a wave of emotion building inside her, desire, guilt, longing, and an inexplicable sense of being truly alive for the first time in years. When the moment subsided, and the intensity gave way to quiet stillness, they lay tangled together on the couch, their bodies still flush with warmth. Lucas's hand rested lightly on her waist, his thumb brushing small, soothing circles against her skin, while Rachel's head nestled against his chest, her breathing gradually slowing in time with his. Neither of them spoke right away, the weight of what they'd just shared settling over them like a fragile, unspoken truth. Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the steady rise and fall of Lucas's chest beneath her cheek, her mind a blur of emotions. The act itself had been undeniable, passionate, intimate, deeply personal, and yet the implications of it loomed in the periphery of her thoughts. "Are you okay?" Lucas's voice broke the silence, his tone low and filled with both concern and tenderness. Rachel nodded slowly, her fingers brushing against his chest. "I am," she whispered, though the words felt like an incomplete truth. "I don't know what this means, but I don't regret it." Lucas exhaled softly, his hand tightening ever so slightly on her waist. "Neither do I," he murmured, his voice steady. "But I know this changes everything." Rachel didn't respond immediately, her thoughts caught between the lingering warmth of his touch and the cold reality waiting for them outside the room. She didn't regret it, not in the way she thought she might. But the weight of what they'd done, what it meant for her, for Lucas, for Anna, was something she couldn't ignore. As they lay there, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of their stolen moment, Rachel allowed herself to feel it all, the joy, the guilt, the longing, and the fear. She knew the path ahead would be anything but simple. But for now, she chose to stay in the moment just a little longer, letting herself be held by the man who had reignited a fire she hadn't known was still inside her. The room hummed with an almost electric stillness as Rachel let herself sink deeper into the moment. Every barrier she'd built over years of carefully guarded restraint seemed to dissolve under Lucas's touch, his hands moving with a reverence that both soothed and awakened something long dormant within her. The air around them felt charged, heavy with a tension that was no longer unspoken but fully alive, wrapping them in its inescapable pull. Her fingers traced the lines of his shoulders, lingering on the warmth of his skin, memorizing the way his body responded to her touch. Lucas kissed her again, slower this time, his lips moving against hers with an intensity that made her heart ache. His hands slid lower, gripping her hips as he guided her closer, their bodies aligning in a way that felt seamless, like they had been meant for this moment all along. The world outside ceased to exist. The whispers of the ocean and the distant creak of the old beach house faded into insignificance as their breaths intermingled, their movements fluid and natural, as though they'd been following this rhythm for years. The feel of him, the heat of his skin, the strength in his arms, the way he held her as if she were something precious, sent shivers coursing through her, erasing any lingering doubts. Rachel's mind teetered on the edge of reason and instinct, the logical voice inside her growing fainter with each passing second. The way Lucas touched her, the way he looked at her, as though she were the only thing that mattered, it was intoxicating. His kisses trailed along her jawline, down her neck, and across her collarbone, leaving a trail of warmth that seemed to sink into her very bones. She tilted her head back, her breath hitching as his hands found the small of her back, pulling her even closer. There was no hesitation now. The soft rustle of fabric falling away felt like shedding the weight of years of loneliness and longing. Each barrier that disappeared between them brought a deeper intimacy, a connection that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Rachel's hands roamed over him, exploring the hard planes of his chest, the curve of his shoulders, the strength in his arms. She wanted to know every part of him, to hold on to this fleeting moment as if it could somehow anchor her in a life that had felt adrift for so long. Lucas's touch became more insistent, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and consuming. Rachel responded with equal fervor, her body arching into his as they moved together, their breaths mingling in the quiet of the room. The glow of the moonlight streaming through the window bathed them in a soft light, adding an ethereal quality to the intimacy they shared. The unspoken acknowledgement of what they were doing lingered between them, but it only added to the intensity of the moment. It was reckless, dangerous, and entirely out of character for Rachel. And yet, as she clung to Lucas, as his hands traced paths across her skin that left her breathless, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Time seemed to lose all meaning as they explored the depths of their connection. The quiet gasps, the whispered names, the way their bodies moved together, it was all-consuming, a tempest of emotion and sensation that left no room for anything else. Rachel felt herself unraveling under his touch, her mind empty of everything but the feeling of being wanted, of being seen. When the intensity finally gave way to a quiet stillness, they lay entwined on the couch, their bodies still pressed close, their breathing gradually slowing. Rachel rested her head against Lucas's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as her fingers idly traced patterns along his side. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, heavy but not oppressive. Lucas's hand rested on her back, his fingers moving in gentle, soothing circles. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice still tinged with the hoarseness of their shared passion. Rachel nodded, though her mind was still spinning. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas tightened his hold on her slightly, his lips brushing against her temple. "I don't either," he said honestly. "But I know this, what we just shared, it wasn't nothing. And I don't regret it." Rachel closed her eyes, her chest tightening at his words. "Neither do I," she murmured, though the weight of guilt had already begun to creep in at the edges of her mind. She thought of Anna, of the friendship they had shared for years, and a pang of shame coursed through her. But then Lucas shifted, tilting her face toward his as his eyes searched hers. "Rachel," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know what this means for the future, but right now in this moment I know I care about you. And I want you to know that." The sincerity in his gaze sent a fresh wave of warmth through her, and she nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wanted to believe in the possibility of something more, even as the reality of their actions loomed over them. They remained in each other's arms, the silence stretching between them filled with both comfort and uncertainty. Rachel knew the road ahead would be complicated, that the choices they had made tonight would have consequences they couldn't yet fully comprehend. But for now, she let herself stay in the moment, savoring the feeling of being held, of being wanted, of being seen. Whatever came next, Rachel knew one thing for certain. This night, this connection would change everything. The soft gray of dawn began creeping through the windows, casting a pale light over the room. Rachel lay still, her head resting on Lucas's chest, her body cocooned in the warmth of his arms. His steady breathing and the faint rise and fall of his chest should have been comforting, but the reality of what they had done lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Rachel stirred, her fingers brushing absent-mindedly against his skin. She didn't want to move, didn't want to face the consequences waiting for them outside the sanctuary of this moment. But the clarity of the early morning brought with it an undeniable truth: this could not last. As much as her heart wanted to stay tangled in his arms, her mind reminded her of the impossible situation they'd created. Lucas shifted, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment he simply looked at her, his gaze soft and unguarded. "Hey," he murmured, his voice still heavy with sleep. Rachel forced a small smile, though her chest tightened. "Hey!" The silence that followed was heavy, both of them acutely aware of the weight of what had transpired. Lucas's hand moved to her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "You're thinking too much," he said softly, his lips curving into a faint smile. She let out a shaky breath, her hand resting against his. "How can I not? We crossed a line, Lucas, a line we can't uncross." His expression grew serious, and he propped himself up slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I know," he admitted, "but I don't regret it. Not a single moment." Rachel's chest ached at his words, her guilt warring with the lingering warmth of his touch. "I don't regret it either," she said quietly. "But this, it can't happen again." Lucas's hand fell away, and his brow furrowed as he studied her. "Because of Anna." "Yes," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Because of Anna. Because of everything this could destroy." Lucas sat up fully now, running a hand through his hair as he exhaled deeply. "I know you're right," he said after a moment, his tone laced with reluctance. I don't know how to pretend this didn't happen." Rachel sat up too, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as she looked down at her hands. "We don't have to pretend," he said softly, "but we do have to move on. We have to let this be a moment, a beautiful, reckless, impossible moment, and nothing more." Her words hung in the air, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lucas reached out, taking her hand in his. "I care about you, Rachel," he said earnestly. "And I'm sorry for putting you in this position." She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "We're both to blame, Lucas. Caring about each other doesn't make this right." He nodded, his grip on her hand tightening briefly before he let go. "What happens now?" Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Now we go back to being who we were before last night. For Anna, for ourselves, for everything we don't want to ruin." Lucas looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "You're stronger than you think, Rachel," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." She closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. When he pulled away, the loss of his warmth felt almost unbearable, but she knew it was necessary. Slowly, she stood, gathering her clothes and dressing in silence. Lucas did the same, the charged atmosphere between them now replaced by a solemn understanding. As they moved toward the door, Rachel paused, turning back to him. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you. For everything." He gave her a sad smile, his eyes filled with emotions she couldn't name. "Take care of yourself, Rachel." With that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quiet against the hardwood floors. The morning air outside was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the heat that had burned between them the night before. Rachel inhaled deeply, letting the sea breeze fill her lungs as she stepped onto the terrace. The house was still silent, the others not yet awake. She stood there for a long moment, staring out at the ocean as the sun began to rise, its golden light spreading across the waves. The beauty of the scene was almost enough to distract her from the weight in her chest. Almost. She knew she would carry this moment with her for the rest of her life, the joy, the guilt, the longing. It would remain a secret locked away in her heart, a memory she could never share but would always hold close. And as painful as it was to walk away, Rachel knew it was the right thing to do. The day ahead would be just like any other, filled with laughter and conversations and the illusion of normalcy. But Rachel would never forget the night she'd felt truly alive, even if it was fleeting, even if it could never happen again. Rachel stayed on the terrace a moment longer, letting the soft hues of dawn calm her racing thoughts. The guilt was sharp, like a thorn pressing into her chest, but there was something else too, something she couldn't quite name. A strange mixture of grief and gratitude swirled within her, warring for space in her heart. The sound of footsteps behind her jolted her back to reality, and she turned quickly. It was Anna, her best friend, wrapped in a blanket and cradling a cup of coffee. Her hair was tousled, and her expression was peaceful in a way that made Rachel's stomach twist with guilt. "Couldn't sleep?" Anna asked, her voice soft as she joined Rachel by the railing. Rachel forced a smile, her hands gripping the wood tightly. "Yeah, something like that. The air's nice out here, though." Anna nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "Lucas always says the morning air at the beach feels different, cleaner, I guess. He'll probably be up soon. You know he can't sleep past sunrise." Rachel's chest tightened at the mention of his name. She glanced sideways at Anna, her friend's face serene, completely unaware of the storm raging inside Rachel. How could she sit here, making small talk, when the weight of her betrayal threatened to crush her? But the words wouldn't come. They couldn't. Anna sighed, her gaze drifting toward the ocean. "I'm so glad you came on this trip, Rachel. We've missed you. I know we don't say it enough, but you're family to us." The words hit like a hammer, and Rachel's forced smile faltered. She looked away, her throat tightening. "That means a lot," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Anna didn't seem to notice her discomfort. "You've been through so much these past few years," she continued, her tone sympathetic. "I just want you to know we're here for you. Lucas and I both. Whatever you need." Rachel's grip on the railing tightened, her knuckles white. The kindness in Anna's voice only deepened the ache in her chest, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to confess, to lay everything bare and beg for forgiveness. But how could she destroy the trust of the one person who had always stood by her? Instead, she nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Thank you, Anna," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "That means more than you know." Anna reached out and squeezed Rachel's hand, her touch warm and comforting. "You're my best friend," she said simply. "I just want you to be happy." Rachel's heart clenched, and she blinked back the sting of tears. Happy. The word felt hollow, an impossible goal in the face of everything she had done. But she nodded again, unable to trust herself to speak. When Anna eventually went back inside, Rachel remained on the terrace, staring out at the endless expanse of water. The sun was fully up now, painting the ocean in shades of gold and blue. The beauty of the scene felt muted, distant. She couldn't stay here, couldn't face the weight of what she had done in the presence of the people she had wronged. Rachel made her decision quickly, retreating to her room to pack her things. She left a note on the kitchen counter, a vague excuse about needing to get back to work and her gratitude for the invitation. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could manage. When she stepped outside, bag in hand, the house was still quiet. She glanced back once, her heart heavy with both regret and relief, before walking to her car and driving away. The drive home was long and silent, the sound of the tires on the pavement a dull backdrop to her racing thoughts. She replayed the events of the past night over and over, the memory of Lucas's touch, his words, his warmth. It had been intoxicating, all-consuming, and yet, it had left her feeling more lost than ever. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun was high in the sky, casting harsh light on the familiar streets. Rachel carried her bag inside and sank onto the couch, staring at the wall as the weight of everything finally came crashing down. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had betrayed her best friend, a woman who had been more like a sister to her than anyone else in her life. And for what? A fleeting moment of connection, of passion, of feeling truly alive?